3 minutes after 10 is the time. So just sort of making a list. I've got a future king of England. I'm going to say England just for a sort of verbal convenience or rhetorical flourish. So you've got a future king of England. You've got all the bishops in the Church of England. You've got British lawyers, and you've got human rights legislation drafted by British lawyers at the behest of Winston Churchill, finally constituting, when it became the European Convention of Human Rights, on human rights, becoming that. And constituting one of Winston Churchill's proudest achievements, according to Winston Churchill, certainly one of his most precious legacies. And that's all in the firing line today in Boris Johnson's Brexit Britain. So I'm very sceptical about there being such a thing as cancel culture, because it usually seems to me to involve people demanding the right to say disgusting things without being called disgusting. But I do wonder, actually, whether perhaps we're all looking at it from the wrong angle. People who claim to care about British values, people who use it as a sort of wooden spoon with which they hit the rest of us over the head, are currently attacking a future king of England, all of the bishops in the Church of England, one of Winston Churchill's most precious legacies, British lawyers, the rule of law, and legislation drawn up by British lawyers in order to do two things, as I understand it, to guard against Stalin's Russia, which was very much on the rise, and to guard against the possibility of a repetition of Adolf Hitler's Germany, of Nazi Germany. And I think this is a word I've never used before in the context of law. I think the most beautiful thing about the European Convention on Human Rights is its honesty. As I understand it, and I want to stress that I'm not, I mean, I know a little bit more about these issues than, say, I don't know, Priti Patel and Liz Truss, but I'm no expert on any of this stuff. As I understand it, the beautiful but rather chilling principle upon which the European Convention on Human Rights is built is that it could actually happen anywhere. So you came out of the back of the Second World War reeling from man's inhumanity to man. I mean, truly reeling from what was done on European soil by one European to another. And you wanted, if you had won that war, if you were Winston Churchill and his allies, not an infallible or a perfect human being, but nonetheless somebody who most people who wang on about British values are supposed to revere and respect. What it was designed to do was to recognise that that kind of horror could happen anywhere, that any country could fall victim to, I suppose we'd have to say, I don't know in Stalin's case whether the R word works, but to corrupt demagogues. Any country could fall victim to populist, corrupt demagogues. So if it wasn't for the madness of the last 6 years, I suspect that events in America on January the 6th of last year would have constituted the most resounding and important reminder of why we are so lucky to be signatories to the European Convention on Human Rights. It exists literally to prevent the kind of behaviour and the kind of people that came close to toppling the biggest democracy, or arguably the most powerful democracy in the world. Isn't that incredible? Because what Churchill recognised is that it could even happen here. That's the absolute beauty of it. And this is what an awful lot of the people who told you that leaving the European Union would make us richer and that they needed us more than we needed them and that we'd be able to stay in the single market while abolishing freedom of movement, all of the people, and they've already been on the telly and the radio today, Ian Duncan Smith, Gerald Howarth, all of these people who've been proved catastrophically wrong about what leaving the European Union would look like, and now limbering up, secure in the knowledge that they'll be invited to write newspaper columns and be invited onto loads of programmes. They're limbering up to do even more damage to our country, to display even more weapons-grade ignorance about issues they don't have the first inkling of understanding of. How can Ian Duncan Smith move effortlessly from claiming that there was no need to read the withdrawal agreement because everybody understood what was in it, to complaining about what was in the withdrawal agreement after actually reading what he called the fine print, to preparing now to vote to abandon the withdrawal agreement because it's something that we should never have signed up to in the first place, and yet still think, when he is invited to pontificate upon membership of the European Convention of Human Rights, still think that he has any qualifications or authority to comment upon anything ever again. And yet here we are, with a sort of grim sense of inevitability. We're now going to have a debate about whether or not we should leave the European Convention of Human Rights, which I don't know whether you're aware of this, but it's always a school day on this programme, isn't it? You have the subscription to the ECHR written in to the Good Friday Agreement, but also written into the trade agreement that we currently have with the European Union. So somehow leaving that, and two countries, do you know which two countries have left the European Convention of Human Rights since it was originally signed? I'll tell you in a minute. So leaving it, and whether people like Ian Duncan Donuts even understand this, I do not know. Our job, of course, is to tell them or to ask them whether they know this. It would automatically endanger and possibly negate the Good Friday Agreement, which the government is currently breaking international law to, quotes, protect, end quotes, and the TCA, the Trade and Community Agreement that we have, the trading agreement that we've signed with the European Union, both of which have membership of the ECHR, subscription to the ECHR baked in to the detail. Isn't that incredible? And yet here you are, being invited once again to jump up and down, complain about foreigners, in this case foreign judges. Don't mention the fact that every signatory to the convention provides one judge. There are 47 judges, including a British one. It is a cooperative supranational effort designed to ensure that what happened in Germany in particular could not happen again. What happened in Germany in the first half of the 20th century couldn't happen again in another European country at any other point. At some point. And I guess what we need to be aware of is that it works. It works really well. You would have laughed at me 10 years ago if I'd given you one of my well-rehearsed lines about the only people who should really have a problem with human rights legislation are the ones who aren't humans, right? But now, having persuaded us to impose economic sanctions on our own country, crippling our own economy, having persuaded us to abolish our own freedom of movement because something foreigners something, having persuaded us to inflict untold damage on our international reputation by boasting about our willingness to break international law and lying about our readiness to do it, the same people who've done all of that to the United Kingdom are about to start trying to persuade you to abandon the European Convention of Human Rights. And I don't just mean the politicians. I mean people in this profession as well. I mean journalists. I mean the usual suspects. Daily Mail today doing a hatchet job on Michelle Hussein of Radio 4's Today programme, of all people. It's incredible what happens when populist, corrupt demagoguery takes hold. All bets are off, leading to a country in which future king, all the bishops from the Church of England, and one of Winston Churchill's most precious legacies, and British lawyers, are all today coming under attack from people who tell you that they're the ones sticking up for British values. That doesn't make any sense at all, does it? What are the values that you're sticking up for over at the Daily Mail? You attack British judges, you attack British politicians, you attack British lawyers, you attack Winston Churchill's most enduring and precious legacy, you attack a future king of England. What are the values you actually stick up for? The right to be racist, which is not a British value at all. Neither is it unique. It exists in all societies. Or the desire to be racist does. I'm not even sure what the question is yet, but I do know that the one I'll answer, the two countries that have voluntarily detached themselves from the European Convention of Human Rights are Greece, which did so after a military coup, but returned once normality and democracy had been restored. So if you're in the business of military coups, you need to get yourself out of the European Convention of Human Rights. And Russia, when it invaded Ukraine. And that's the company that people like Ian Duncan Smith and various Sun and Daily Mail journalists will be encouraging you to keep. We need to be more like military coup Greece and post-Ukraine invasion Russia. They're the kind of countries we should be getting into bed with. That's what we want to look like. That is the face we want to present to the rest of the world. Who do you want to be like? Post-military coup Greece and post-Ukraine invasion Russia. That's it. And I find it a curious combination. 52% incredible and unbelievable, 48% ploddingly inevitable. That the same stupid people with their stupid Little England arguments are going to be coming out now to make the same pointless, fact-free claims about membership of something that Winston Churchill dreamt of and delivered. Winston Churchill dreamt of and delivered. And we're supposed to listen to people like Ian Duncan Smith and Jacob Rees-Mogg tell us why we should undo one of his most precious legacies. The mind boggles, right? Absolutely boggles. 14 minutes after 10 is the time. I'll play you that brilliant little sketch that Patrick Stewart recorded with other performers and actors, because what it does is rather beautifully resurrect one of Monty Python's most famous sketches, where a bunch of anti-Roman Brits were sitting around complaining about the Roman invasion, and one of them asked, "What have the Romans ever done for us?" And the answer was, well, loads, actually. Starting, I think, with roads, wasn't it? And then pretty much everything else that you could consider to be a kind of national achievements almost. And so the question, what has the European Convention of Human Rights ever done for us, is something that satirists can see the stupidity of absolutely clearly, but it still needs to be answered. So I'll play you that when we come back. And then we'll get stuck into the question of, well, why this is so effective, I think. Why people who have been proved catastrophically wrong about leaving one supranational organisation with myriad membership benefits are now being invited to tell you why we should leave another one. In this case, one which was literally conceived to guard against a repetition of fascism in Europe. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. And of course, I do recognise that if you are listening to this programme and you are not human, then you may have a meaningful and cogent basis for opposing human rights. But if you are a human and you're listening to people telling you to abandon even more rights, and you're looking back over the successful attempt to convince you to abolish your own freedom of movement, then it's probably time to give your head a wobble. 18 minutes after 10 is the time. You quite rightly picked me up on that. I got my Monty Python references wrong. Just as well we're clearing that up, because I think John Cleese is going to follow Michael Palin onto Full Disclosure this summer, which is rather exciting. It's from Life of Brian, of course, isn't it? And it's not Brits who are asking what the Romans has ever done for us. It's Judeans, whether they are from the Judean People's Front or indeed the People's Front of Judea. So what have the Romans ever done for us is rendered a really, really stupid question by a long list of things that the Romans had done for them. And similarly, anybody bovine enough to ask the question, what has the European Convention of Human Rights ever done for us, would do well to have a little look at this short film put together by the Guardian newspaper with the help of Sir Patrick Stewart. You'll enjoy this, I think, but it is, of course, supposed to be satire, rather than waking up today and realising that it is, in fact, clairvoyance.
What has the European Convention of Human Rights ever done for us in return?
Oh, the right to a fair trial.
What?
The right to a fair trial.
Well, that's true, I suppose.
The right to privacy?
Well, yes, all right. I grant you, fair trials and privacy are two things the European Convention of Human Rights has given us. But
What about freedom from torture and degrading treatment?
Freedom of religion.
Freedom of expression.
Freedom from discrimination.
Oh, how about freedom from slavery?
yes, of course, freedom from slavery goes without saying. But
Protecting victims of domestic violence.
Okay, but apart from the right to a fair trial, the right to privacy, freedom of religion, freedom of expression, freedom from discrimination, freedom from slavery, and freedom from torture.
And degrading treatment.
And degrading treatment and protecting victims of domestic violence. But apart from these, what has the European Convention on Human Rights ever done for us?
Peace in Northern Ireland?
What?
Well, I mean, and the Good Friday Agreement depends on the European Convention of Human Rights. So without it, we'd have to make peace all over again. And what a palaver that would be. No, thank you.
No, look here. I'm not against human rights, of course not. But I say we don't need lectures from the frogs and the crowds.
Quite right.
This is Britain, the land of Magna Carta. We invented human rights, for God's sake. We should be writing our own Bill of Rights and foisting it on the Europeans. Let's see how they'd like it then.
We've already done that, actually.
What?
Well, after we won the war, British legal experts did draft a Bill of Human Rights to help Europe sort itself out, you know, protect people from abuses of state power, that kind of thing.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
You sure?
Oh, yes.
Oh. Well, that's good. What's it called?
The European Convention on Human Rights.
Off.
You know how much I love the sound of my own voice, so it's got to be pretty good for me to dedicate a significant chunk of the programme to something else like that. I normally possibly play with clips of politicians saying things that have been proven horribly wrong subsequently, but there it is. I mean, those are the facts. Now, staying with facts. Phone lines are open, by the way. 0345 606 0973. Have you ever heard of Sir James Fawcett? Have you ever heard of Sir James Edmund Sandford Fawcett, DSc, QC? He was a very prominent and rather brilliant British barrister. He was also a member of the European Commission for Human Rights from 1962 to 1984. Indeed, he was its president from 1972 to 1981, an achievement which in large part contributed to him being knighted in 1984. What's that you've not heard? You've never heard of Sir James Fawcett. Have you heard of his grandson? He's got a grandson who goes by the name Boris Johnson. And Boris Johnson said not long ago, about 6 years ago, I'm a supporter of the European Convention on Human Rights. It was one of the great things we gave to Europe under Winston Churchill. I'm not against the ECHR or the court because it's very important for us. So once again, the question of what he will not trash in pursuit of self-protection and bizarre vanity looks like having the answer absolutely nothing. 23 minutes after 10 is the time. Do you think it will work? Now that we've seen how successfully the population, or 52% of the electorate, was persuaded to vote to punch itself in the face repeatedly for decades to come, do you think that humans in Boris Johnson's Brexit Britain can be successfully persuaded to reject their own rights, to reject their own human rights, and urinate all over one of Sir Winston Churchill's most precious legacies? Genuine question, because I've got to tell you, and I know a lot of you tune into this programme in the morning to feel supported and to have some pleasure in the fact that some of us do recognise the nakedness, the nudity of the Emperor, but I've got to tell you, I think it might work. In fact, I'd go a little further. I think it probably will. I think it probably will work. If you can persuade a population to abolish its own freedom of movement and impose economic sanctions on itself, I think you can persuade some of the humans in that population to abolish their own human rights. Discuss. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. Kieran is in Maidstone. Kieran, what would you like to say?
Oh, hello, James. How are you?
Very well, Kieran. What's on your mind?
Good. Massive fan of yours, by the way.
You don't have to be, by the way. It's sometimes more fun when people who aren't massive fans ring in, as we discovered yesterday, perhaps. But carry on.
Yeah. I'm a fanboy. Well, do you know what? Like the thing is, obviously, like listening to the way you've spoken over, literally pretty much since 2016, and the thing is, I always used to agree with you and used to say, obviously, contempt for the con man, compassion for the con.
Yeah.
it was like, as I was saying to your researcher, I think it's gone past that
It's
now.
wearing a bit thin, that now, isn't it? Because they're not sort of repenting of the damage that they've done to all of us. They're moving on to the next thing they can set fire to. In this case, the European Convention on Human Rights.
Yeah, and that was the thing. And I was listening to your colleague Tom's show last night, and like the thing is, he was literally linking this together with like the thing going on in like Northern Ireland and everything like that. And as you rightly said, it's just like, how can people who love Winston Churchill, who love Winston Churchill, who were screaming the fact that people were throwing eggs and tarnishing his statue.
You can't. That's a brilliant point. Don't you dare throw an egg at his statue, but by all means set fire to one of his most valued and precious legacies.
It just doesn't make sense. And
that's
like,
incredible. What a brilliant point, Kieran. I've got to tell you, mate, I'm nicking that. I'm passing that off as my own, henceforth. Sorry, but at least I'm being honest about it. That you're going to hear that come out of your radio several times in the coming months, and on no single occasion will I credit you with it, apart from just at this moment now. 10:26, Wednesday, June the 15th, 2022. That brilliant observation currently belongs to Kieran in Maidstone, but now it's all mine. Sorry, carry on, Kieran.
No problem. So it's like kind of thing where obviously we don't want to. We're going to end up going back to that whole sort of like Brexity debate thing.
That's what they want, though, isn't it? And that's why that's why I'm not thumping the desk today. I'm more dismayed than disgusted or furious, because I don't know that we have any choice but to join in. If they're going to launch an attack on us, if they're going to try and set fire to something precious, you have to resist it, even though the fight is what they really want. It's sad, isn't it?
And like the thing is, as you've always said before, obviously, sort of like I loathe calling him Boris because he's not my mate. Like, you know what I mean? Yeah. So it's just like our Prime Minister, as you said before, he just loves chaos. He just loves absolute chaos, because if there's chaos, number one, us inverted commas plebs, all we're doing is arguing amongst each other. And we're not looking up, and we're not seeing.
And on we go, and that's the problem. I think contempt for the conmen, compassion for the conduct. What was my mantra in the aftermath of the referendum, as we all went on a crash course on what it would really mean. The difference being that some of us were prepared to accept what we learned, and some of us were not. Some people were still furiously resisting reality. Some people continue to do so. And those are the people who will call for you to be hanged from the nearest lamppost if you dared to graffiti a statue of Winston Churchill, while, without even breaking a sweat, calling for the destruction of one of his most valued and precious legacies, the European Convention on Human Rights. It is objectively incredible, that, isn't it? But here we are. Will it work? 03456060973. Steve's in Bromley. Steve, what would you like to say?
Oh, hi, James.
Hi,
it's really an answer to your question, could it happen here? The worrying thing for me is, when you look back through the last couple of years, the attempts by our current Prime Minister to not have Parliament give full scrutiny to the Brexit deal, and it was only the Speaker at the time, John Bercow, who fought for parliamentary rights to make sure that didn't happen. And the last time I can think of that happening before in European history, by the way, was Hitler, when he introduced the Enabling Act in the 1930s that enabled him to do anything. And the second bit of attempted legislation, you'll know about the case of Owen Paterson.
Yes.
Most people seem to have forgotten it. And again, here was an MP who took payments which he decided not to declare.
We're sure on the detail of this. I mean, he did take payments. Whether he declared them or not, I can't remember. But his defence was that he hadn't done any lobbying, and he was found to have done lobbying. That was the corruption of which he was found culpable, found guilty.
Yes.
They sought in response to that revelation to tear up the rules that he had fallen foul of.
Absolutely right. And the company that he took the payments from had received very substantial contracts under the COVID
Again,
program.
I don't think there's that correlation is not causation. Now, I got it out at the end, but I understand the point that you're making. So, in fact, the question, could it happen here, is answered by the European Convention of Human Rights, or rather Winston Churchill answered that question by framing and by commissioning the finest legal minds in Britain to write this convention, because he believed it could happen anywhere.
Yeah, and so it's and the whole point about the European Convention on Human Rights is we signed up to it. We as a nation thought it was, as you say, led by Churchill, thought it was a great idea. We signed up to it, and all the court does, it doesn't make legislation. It just says you signed up to this legislation.
It interprets the convention, so that's why the last minute reprieve yesterday for the poor fella, the one poor fella left who was going to be flown out to Rwanda. That reprieve follows an interpretation of the European Convention on Human Rights, which only the European Court for Human Rights can sit in judgment on, and that is what you sign up for. It's supranational, so it's as if you have an organisation that protects things that are more powerful and more valuable than almost the nationality. And what is more powerful and more valuable than nationality? Humanity. And how do you protect humanity? Human rights. And who would possibly be opposed to that while also being a human? Simon Conway is here now with the headlines. It is 10:34. A story that broke yesterday after we'd come off air. I suggested to you there was something very deliberate and very dangerous about Boris Johnson and Priti Patel continuing to very deliberately paint targets upon the backs of British lawyers. There's already been one terror attack upon an immigration law firm. Yesterday, the Bar Council called upon the Prime Minister to stop attacks on legal professionals who are simply doing their jobs. This followed comments that Boris Johnson made after we'd come off air, prompting the Bar Council and the Law Society of England and Wales to issue the following statement. Legal challenges ensure government is acting lawfully following laws agreed by Parliament. It is misleading and dangerous for the Prime Minister to suggest lawyers who bring such legal challenges are doing anything other than their job and upholding the law. Anyone at risk of a life-changing order has a right to challenge its legality with the assistance of a lawyer who has a duty to advise their client on their rights. That's the Bar Council and Law Society of England and Wales there. We're talking today about even bigger, if you like, legal principles, namely the European Convention on Human Rights, one of the key, the architect of which was Sir Winston Churchill, and one of the key British supporters of historically was Boris Johnson's own grandfather, Sir James Fawcett. So we find ourselves in incredibly murky waters once again. And my question to you, sadly, once again is, do you reckon it will work? They say that this will be very popular in the Red Wall, they tell me. The terror, the fear of people coming over the English Channel in boats is such that you can turn it into political capital. By-elections on the horizon, and there's a wonderful war going on at home now between people who support human rights legislation and humans who don't. I see it that simply. Perhaps I'm wrong to do so. And of course, no one ever mentions the Dublin Convention, the fact that by leaving the European Union, we lost the right to legally remove failed asylum seekers back to previous countries. We literally left that. We literally abandoned that as a consequence of leaving the European Union. But anyway, my next guest told you to leave the European Union, and he's now going to talk diluted gibberish about why we should also abandon the European Convention on Human Rights. Will be a line coming out of the mouths of most presenters in the coming days, but thankfully not this one. 10:36 is the time. Jarrell is in Hackney. Jarrell, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello.
Morning.
Hello, mate.
I think you're being a bit naive if you think it's not going to work. Of course it's going to work.
I do think it's going to work. I said I think it's going to work.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, the problem is, when you say how can people who love Winston Churchill...
Because I'm very proud of that point that I made earlier. I thought that was brilliant, that observation.
Well, it's because a lot of these people don't love Winston Churchill. They love winning.
Yes.
And Churchill is just an avatar of Britain having won. And... I mean, demagogues, all they care about is winning, and they'll say whatever needs to be said to win the argument. And it's happening with the lawyers as well. You can point out all the laws, all the reasons why we shouldn't be doing something, and they'll just turn to, well, the law's wrong then. The same thing with the Good Friday Agreement. The Good Friday Agreement prevents us having the Brexit solution, and they'll say, well, just change that.
And of course, that's why the earlier caller mentioned the Owen Paterson debacle when they tried to tear up the rules on parliamentary standards because one of their favourite sons had broken them.
Exactly.
You've broken the rules, change the rules. Crikey, it is pretty transparent, isn't it, when you think of it like that?
Yeah, it's sad, but it will work. It's just all we can hope is that this is one of those stories that goes over a lot of people's heads, so that it doesn't have too much of an impact electorally.
As soon as you say that, I turn with a heavy heart to the front page of the Daily Mail, you see, because that is probably the tool used most effectively to ensure that none of this culture war horror show goes over people's heads, leading the line on potentially inciting violence against lawyers. That's a fear of the Bar Council, who've cautioned Boris Johnson to stop doing it, but they can't really address the Daily Mail on this. And their front page is Euro Court grounds jet to Rwanda, not mentioning Winston Churchill. So there's a wonderful example there of an individual or an institution, whether you're talking about the editor or whether it's the owner who makes these decisions, I don't know. But threaten to graffiti Winston Churchill's statue and you will be public enemy number one. Threaten to torch one of his most valuable and precious legacies and you're a patriotic hero who should be applauded at all costs.
Pretty much. Business as usual.
Thank you, mate. You haven't exactly cheered me up. 10:39 is the time. Stuart's in Durham. Stuart, what do you think?
The European Convention of Human Rights, as an ex-police officer, and I'm not long out of the police, it's a thing of beauty. I've had people argue for and against it, and my role when I was in the police was to advise senior officers, particularly along the lines of demonstrations and other bits and pieces. So all the time, when you're making judgment calls, you're balancing the rights of everybody, protesters on one side and the other, and the general public at large.
I mean, I'd said earlier that beautiful is not a word I would often use in the context of legislation, but the things that are framed to protect us and to almost enshrine our humanity are beautiful things. And Churchill would have, I think, agreed with every word you've said. How do you account then? And of course, we know that this government has a particular problem with public protest because they're keen to introduce legislation to limit it fairly viciously, fairly severely. How do you account for the mindset, then, that can be persuaded to despise the very thought of somebody graffitiing or damaging a statue of a man, but will very happily go along with the destruction of one of his most precious and valued legacies?
I think it's a lot of sort of misunderstanding. It's this, let's hate Europe, let's hate Europe.
Yeah.
But when you sit down and speak to people, I've had people, where I'm meeting them in the course of my ex-job.
Yes.
Where they say, we need to scrap this human rights legislation, and you just say, but what parts do you want to scrap? The right to a private and family life, the right that would stop me or anybody else basically killing you.
Yeah.
The state has the balances between. It's like the second article, the right to life.
Yes.
Everybody has the right to life, but at some point, it could be a police officer, if we're looking at a terrorist situation, will invoke getting rid of that Article 2 and killing the terrorist at that point.
Yes.
So there's all those checks and balances amongst it. The statute argument, the law probably look at it very black and white. So when it goes to a Crown prosecutor, somebody has damaged a statue, that's an offence under the Criminal Damage Act, Section 1. We're going to charge them with that. That's it. That's all the lawyer will look at. When it goes to court, and if it goes to a jury trial, a jury may acquit because they think, well, the Coulson statue, well, they had a right to do it. He's an ex-slaver. He wasn't a very nice man. Let's acquit. If that makes sense.
It does, yeah. Of course it does. I mean, laws are... I guess what it also hinges upon is the very Brexity thing about, I didn't mean you. So, look, we'll abolish that because we don't like them, but won't join the dots to realise that we're actually abolishing stuff for ourselves as well, or that we think we're voting or supporting a notion that's going to hurt the other, in this case, the refugee, the Iranian policeman who fled the country after refusing to shoot protesters. We want to hurt him, but we don't want to join the dots sufficiently to recognise that we're actually going to be abolishing protections that might one day help us or protect us or serve us.
Totally. I mean, the one example I could sort of give was we were at a protest and there was a gentleman from the right-wing side, if you want to call him that,
yes.
was espousing views. He was on a political platform. You would call him one of the more educated ones rather than a knuckle dragger.
Yes.
And he basically was saying the white race are the supreme race.
Right.
But he was doing it in a form of words that he literally hadn't crossed the line in the sand. So it wasn't sort of a racial hatred.
Sure.
So what we did, in effect, was recorded what he was doing.
Yeah.
We knew who he was. We knew we could identify him, and if it needed arresting at a later date, and it did go up, obviously, to senior lawyers and bits and pieces. And they said he hadn't crossed the line. His speech is abhorrent.
Well, they know exactly what they're doing. I mean, and that's not confined to any extremity, because there have been Islamist fundamentalists who one of whom was indeed a trained lawyer, who I think he got it wrong eventually. He crossed the line eventually, but they know exactly what they can and can't say. And as you say, it's often some of the less educated acolytes that end up getting into more trouble. So little Tommy Ten Names is never out of court because he doesn't have the intellectual stones to understand where the lines are between what is legal and what is not legal.
If you look at Farage's poster, which the one with the immigration issue, which I think you've covered plenty of times,
I have.
You can look at it and people might say, I think that's an offence. It's a horrible poster, but he's got the right to do that.
Yes, of course.
Whether you like that or don't like it, he can go back to the European Convention of Human Rights and say, I've got my right to freedom of thought, freedom of expression. That's why I'm doing that. It's my right to do that.
Yeah.
If he puts a few more words in there, then he may commit a criminal offence. But at that stage, he hasn't committed anything.
And of course, his allies in the media and beyond will serve or save their disapproval for people pointing out the irresistible and undeniable echoes with Nazi propaganda. They'll be the people that are told to sit down and shut up, and they could be protected by the ECHR as well. But of course, that is one of those moments where the ECHR becomes something against which we should be opposed. We shouldn't. It's incredible to have it picked apart like this, Stuart, from the front line of policing, as it were.
It's slightly going off track, but another example where ECHR was used, and I'll talk about registered sex offenders.
Yes.
And there was initially, when they were getting orders put on them, it was not to access computers and the internet. And then they've gone away, got lawyers, quite rightly, and when you look at it, they're going, well, how do you live a modern life without accessing the internet? How do you access without using a mobile phone? How do you do banking? So they may have part of the restrictions that police can come in and view their internet browsing history and what they've done on that device, but to say you cannot never ever use the internet or you cannot ever use a mobile phone, it's common sense.
It is absurd, although I guess when you're in the business of trying to winning votes by hurting people, in this case people who don't deserve much sympathy but do deserve the most basic of human rights, because the most basic human does, then it becomes politically attractive to do these really stupid, clumsy things. And that's why I keep hearing echoes of Brexit already, because, you know, where there is nuance, complexity and expertise, you will find people claiming that it's really simple, straightforward and binary. And look what happened last time. Those two forces came head to head. 52-48. Stuart, thank you, mate. That's one of the most helpful calls I can remember taking in a long time, because you know a lot more about this stuff than I do. 10:46 is the time. 10:50 is the time. If you want to have a crack at answering the question of how people can be outraged by the prospect of somebody graffitiing a statue of Winston Churchill, but supremely comfortable, and I'm thinking about cabinet ministers now and newspaper editors, not just, you know, your next door neighbour or your Uncle Terry, supremely comfortable with the idea of torching one of Winston Churchill's most enduring and important legacies. So graffitiing a statue, capital offence. Torching Churchill's legacy, close to government policy. Just talk me through how you think that can happen. And you'll have to be quick, 03456060973, because we are moving on, I think, after 11 o'clock to matters Scottish. So alert anybody who may be interested in that it is on the horizon. Before that, I'm going to talk to Paul Brand, who you will know as the man who I think did more than pretty much anybody else in the media to bring some of the Partygate revelations to our attention. He's the UK editor for ITV News, and he is currently in Kigali, the capital of Rwanda. So before we get into the seriousness, Paul. You are there, presumably, in expectation of watching people get off the plane that never took off.
Yeah, hi James. Yeah, I'm in the capital, as you say, Kigali. In fact, I'm just outside the genocide memorial here in Kigali, which remembers the 1 million victims of the genocide here in 1994. And this country obviously has an incredibly painful past. And this whole policy, this whole deal that it's done with the United Kingdom, in some ways, is about trying to recast itself internationally as a welcoming, as a safe place for people to come to. And we were anticipating that flight to land here early this morning. Those asylum seekers should have been on their way to a hostel by now on the other side of the city. But of course, that flight is not happening anymore. And the government here is bitterly disappointed and just as determined, actually, as the UK government to try and continue with this policy and to get asylum seekers onto the next flight.
You've also been looking into what sort of treatment they may receive there. As I understand it, the European Convention on Human Rights' ruling is built in part upon the lack of confidence that people deported to Rwanda would be monitored by the British government, that there would be proper efforts made to ensure that their treatment was fair. But you were on the case before that, so to speak, by looking at human rights concerns in Kigali. What have you found? What have you learned?
Yeah, I mean, human rights organisations have been raising this as a concern for years, particularly around freedom of expression and political freedoms here in Rwanda. There's no real sort of official, well, there is an official, but it's not a genuine political opposition to the president who's ruled here for decades. So politically, this country isn't sort of free. And we wanted to get under the skin of that the past couple of days. And we've certainly found anecdotally that there is a certain level of sort of political intimidation here. People haven't felt able to speak to us freely when we've been interviewing them. And in fact, we interviewed someone yesterday who was immediately then reported to the authorities, and we had to pull that interview because we feared for his safety. So it is a difficult country for local journalists, certainly, to operate in. And as I say, we've seen firsthand that those freedoms aren't as secure as they are, certainly, in the United Kingdom. And that's been a concern all along with this deal with Rwanda. People fleeing persecution, potentially, asylum seekers often flee because of who they are or what they believe or what they've said. And are they then coming to a country where they are still not free to be who they are or say what they want?
So to be clear, people you have interviewed have been reported to the government for participating in your reports?
Yeah, so we conducted an interview yesterday and we were immediately told after that interview that somebody who had witnessed the interview from afar had reported the person who was speaking to us. And there is this sort of, it's difficult for us to verify any of this because the government insisted it was, shocked and flabbergasted to learn that would even happen. But there are journalists, bloggers and YouTubers in prison here in Rwanda. Certainly the concern was great enough for the person that we interviewed that he no longer felt he was able to go on air, and we pulled that interview, as I say. But there is a huge level of paranoia among the journalists here that we've encountered, the local journalists. They feel as though there are, for want of a better word, spies amongst them who report one another if they believe that a journalist is sort of not telling the government line. Most of the media here is sponsored by the government or is pro-government. And as I say, there is an official opposition, which is sort of appointed at the pleasure of the president, but there's not a genuine sort of opposition that's grown up through an independent means. So this isn't a country where you can just sort of say what you want and get away with it.
Ironically, I suppose, these are precisely the sort of freedoms that are enshrined in and protected by the European Convention of Human Rights, to which Rwanda is obviously not a signatory. So you'll be coming back to Britain, obviously, and most of the foreign journalists there will. Who would be charged then with keeping people back in Britain informed about what was happening to asylum seekers that had been deported to Rwanda? If, as you tell us, local journalists are perhaps fearful of the government, or the government is certainly not committed to their freedom of expression, who would the average British voter or indeed politician rely upon for frank and fair reporting of how, if the scheme ever gets off the ground, of how the scheme was actually unfolding in Rwanda?
Well, there isn't anyone, to be quite frank, James, and that is a big concern. Wow. It's one that I was talking about yesterday, because as soon as the international media leaves, and I've got to be fair to the Rwandan government, yes, we as international journalists have not been inhibited in our reporting. I've said some fairly provocative things about the Rwandan government in the past couple of days. Nobody has come back to me and said, how dare you, in the slightest. But it's the local journalists, as I say, that aren't able to operate as freely as we are. And so when we leave, and the whole sort of circus operation of the international media that's focused on this story leaves Rwanda, probably in the next couple of days, because the story is sort of calmed down now that the flight's been delayed, who is going to continue digging into the conditions here? And, we had this big on-camera tour of the hostel, for example, that asylum seekers will come to. Looks great, well, I say great, it looks basic, but it looks perfectly respectable. But, is that the kind of conditions that they will continue living in weeks, months' time, when this story is sort of abated for international journalists? And we're relying on those local reporters to tell us that the promises of the Rwandan government are being kept and these conditions are still respectable.
That's obviously a worry. How long are you going to stay for? There's no prospect, I don't think, because you've done a wonderful job of keeping us abreast of developments in the United Kingdom while also reporting live from Rwanda. But there's no immediate prospect of a plane getting into the air, is there?
No, and we don't know exactly how it is going to play out now, do we, in the courts? And obviously there's a judicial review in July. Does this all get delayed now by a matter of months, potentially? But we anticipate that we will be back in Rwanda next time a flight is carded to be taking off from the UK to land here. So this won't be the last time that we check in and report on what's happening on the ground here. But certainly, for the time being, we intend to leave tomorrow.
Well, good luck. And finally, Paul Brand, you've established, I think, that because it was a plane specially chartered for these deportations, that's approximately £500,000 down the drain for the British government this week.
Yeah, and the government won't confirm the exact sum, but they're pretty upfront about the fact that cost, whatever it is, whether it's 200,000 or 500,000, the cost has been sunk. They paid that upfront. They never intended to be able to get that refunded. So that money's gone now. It could have been spent, I guess, on other things.
Indeed. Paul Brand, many thanks indeed. The UK editor for ITV News, reporting live from Kigali, where he was expecting, of course, at least some asylum seekers to be landing today after that flight was due to take off yesterday. It was down to one by the end. I mean, it's no laughing matter, obviously. But we were perhaps having a little bit of fun yesterday with the question of would they still send it with one asylum seeker on it, and the answer was actually provided, I think, by Liz Truss. Yes, they would have spent £500,000 on one asylum seeker, because as many people have suggested on this programme and beyond, it's not really about detail or substance. It's about symbolism and rhetoric. It's about announcing to people who like this sort of thing that we are being horrible to asylum seekers. And I've also heard a lot of people claim that somehow it's unfair on Rwanda to talk about it in these terms. And I've got one thing to say about this, because I never know whether people have been deliberately stupid or whether, as we had a caller yesterday, they're trying to sound clever in the hope of camouflaging rather racist impulses, or whether there is a genuine need for enlightenment. If you're going to argue that going to Rwanda is not a punishment or that it is perfectly decent, then you'll have to explain to the government that it's not actually a deterrent. It is 3 minutes after 11, and it is time to turn our attention to Scottish independence, which came careering back to the top of the news agenda yesterday after Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister, announced a paper analysing the economic performance of several small countries that she said would trigger a renewed campaign for the breakup of Britain. She hasn't outlined how a referendum would take place, but has signalled that an update would be put to the Scottish Parliament before the power recess. I am rarely more cautious than when I turn my attention to the question of Scottish independence, because it speaks to the very bones of people listening to this programme, and there are people absolutely passionately aligned both to the desire for Scottish independence and the breakup of Britain, and passionately opposed to it. And I have respect for both of those camps, which doesn't happen that often on this programme. I normally find myself happiest in a camp. I normally think that by the time you've crunched the numbers and analysed the evidence, you should have a view. It's why I worry endlessly about the impartiality model that the BBC continues, I think, to muff up on a spectacular scale. And this is where I usually tell the story about Pascal Lamy, the former Director General of the World Trade Organization, and Andrea Leadsom, but I won't bore you with that story yet again. But on this one, I do have equal respect for both sides. Even though, if I had a vote in a coming referendum and you were to hold a metaphorical gun to my head, I would have an answer to the question of which way I would vote, and it may well emerge in the course of the next hour. But it may not be the same way as I would vote 12 months from now, or 12 months ago, or 6 years ago, or 10 years ago, or 10 years from now. That is the point, I think, of all elections. All ballots are decided by people who are capable, even likely, to change their mind about things. They are not decided by those of us who are passionately committed to a position from which we will never be swayed. It's not quite an elephant in a room, that point, is it? Because that's not what the figure of speech is designed to convey. But it is mad to think of how much time we spend talking about politics and analysing politics and all the rest of it, when really all the major decisions are taken by people who don't have pungent opinions. They are decided by people who have changed their minds, from general elections right down to by-elections. That they are decided by people who have changed their mind. Otherwise, nothing would ever change. We'd have exactly the same proportions in the House of Commons, exactly the same government for forever. That's just me being a bit of an anorak, finding that interesting. So some nice words already popping up on the text and the tweets, encouraging other Scottish listeners to tune in, Scottish people with an interest in Scottish independence to tune in, but already evidence of how tricky I found this territory in the past, because I've got one here saying he's not a fan of independence, but he's usually fair. And yet, last time I was in Glasgow, about a month ago, people in the audience there were correctly of the view that at this point in British history, with this particular Prime Minister installed in Downing Street and this particular catalogue of catastrophes being inflicted upon all of us while they continue to claim that they get all the big calls right and are playing some sort of blinder, I would, if I had a vote in a referendum tomorrow, find it incredibly hard not to vote to unhitch my country from the rest of the United Kingdom. I said it might take an hour for me to nail my colours, albeit very lightly, to any mast on this one, and it's barely taken 6 minutes. So here's the line, though, that has given me pause today. It's a headline in the Times. I think it's an accurate reflection of what emerged yesterday, but you are, of course, welcome to challenge this analysis. Sturgeon plans to create hard border. Now, I am fascinated to know whether or not that simple statement actually alters your view on independence. It seems to me that independence, while both Scotland and England remained in the European Union, remained in the single market, remained in the customs union, is a very different proposition from independence without. And any desire by a future Scottish government to align itself with single market regulation would involve, as we've seen in the Irish Sea, and as Mario Sefcovic is explaining again today to people who perhaps will never understand it, you can explain it to them, mate, but you can't understand it for them. You're going to have to take my word for that. You would have to have some sort of hard border checking on goods, and that appears to have been conceded. Nicola Sturgeon has accepted that there will be border checks on goods between an independent Scotland and the rest of the UK. There appears to be some confusion still on whether there would be a hard border for people crossing between Scotland and England. Sturgeon seems confident that there wouldn't be, but if you had her preferred policy of EU membership, would that mean a hard border for people as well as goods? I'm not sure, to be honest with you, but I do know this. If a hard border were introduced between Scotland and England, for goods and possibly for people, but we can start just on goods if you want. That seems to me to be, let's just say, a big deal and a shame, all right? Whether or not it's a big enough shame to overcome desires for independence, I do not know. In some ways, it's not for me to say. But I am British, and having a hard border in Britain is potentially as upsetting as a hard border on the island of Ireland. Not as dangerous. It wouldn't have the historical baggage or the possible consequences, but it just feels to me like a bit of a game changer, and I wonder whether it is a bit of a game changer for you. So I'm particularly interested today in hearing from people who have wavered on this. You've moved perhaps from being opposed to independence, as I think I would have done if I was Scottish, to being in favour of independence as a consequence of what Westminster has done to Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom. Brexit being the most obvious element of that theory, that analysis. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. Thank you, Ted. I'm going to nick your figure of speech here. I've stapled my colours to the independence mast, but it would be very, very easy, given the flimsiness and the flexibility of the staple, to take them off again. But and the knowledge that it would involve a hard border, there would be border checks on goods between an independent Scotland and the rest of the UK, I think has me reaching for the staple remover. Do you remember those little staple removers? Very, very few people had staple removers in their pencil case. And those of us who did very, very rarely used them for removing staples. I seem to remember using them to inflict pain upon fellow pupils. They were like little pincers, and you could get the little spiky bits under the staple and somehow squeeze it out. But here is my staple room. So I've stapled my colours to the independent mast, having previously had them stapled to the other mast. And the notion of a hard border, I don't know, it just seems perhaps to be grounds for reaching for the staple remover. So talk to me about how this particular development, how yesterday's developments have affected your support for or opposition to the prospect of Scottish independence. I'm very intrigued by the fluid nature of the debate, because the first referendum, of course, was conducted without there being any real prospect of the United Kingdom coming out of the European Union. If there is another referendum, and Nicola Sturgeon is understandably adamant that there will be sooner rather than later, it's an entirely different question, but not necessarily an easier one to answer. So talk to me about what your answers are and where you are on the issue, particularly of border checks on goods between an independent Scotland and the rest of the UK. It's hard to imagine a single business being in favour of it, because Scotland doesn't have what Northern Ireland has, which is a potentially huge customer on the same land mass. So you put the border in the Irish Sea and there's no border on the island of Ireland. Goods that would previously have made their way from Birmingham to Belfast are now coming in from Donegal. And that is why Northern Ireland's economy is performing better than Great Britain's. That's just a matter of fact. That's not an opinion. That's counting. So quite why anybody would be seeking to tear up the Northern Irish Protocol when it is delivering prosperity relative to the rest of the United Kingdom to Northern Ireland is, of course, a question that only the particularly belligerent unionists can answer. 12 minutes after 11 is the time. The number you need is 0345 6060 973. The question you need to answer is whether or not yesterday's developments, particularly with reference to a hard border in Britain, have altered in any way your attitude to the question of Scottish independence. And I'll tell you what, this is very unfair on my production team because I hardly ever do it, but I wouldn't mind getting a call on before we head to the break, because we've got PMQs on the way at 12 o'clock, of course, which means Theo Usher will be joining us shortly for a bit of an aperitif to PMQs. And, well, let's just do it. Fraser is in Glasgow. Fraser, what would you like to say? What do you reckon?
Good morning, James. Welcome. Sorry.
Welcome. I'm not moving yet, Fraser.
Yeah. Now that we're independent, it's my show. We're taking over. I'm only joking.
Go on.
I'm all for independence. I was a lifelong Labour supporter and a trade unionist.
Yeah.
My whole life I wanted a better life for everybody.
Yes.
But no matter what we do, we get Tory governments. No matter what we do, we don't. The money that is created in our country, Scotland, is not spent here. The profits end up down south. That's supermarkets, power, oil, whiskey, whatever.
But you know the traditional and I think the correct response to that is the West Lothian question, isn't it? So there is, that's an area of debate rather than you giving the impression as you are now, Fraser, of certainty and solidity. So it's not that clean cut. But talk to me about the hard border. That's what I'm particularly interested in today.
The hard border would not be of Scotland's choice. That would be what we would call the rest of the UK.
Yeah, but the hard border in the Irish Sea, the border in the Irish Sea is not Great Britain's choice. It's a consequence of having two different regulatory frameworks in place, and that's what Scotland would be voting for under Nicola Sturgeon's preferred option, which would be EU alignment. So it is Scotland's choice, really.
No, we have not said that we are joining the EU, and that wouldn't be an immediate thing.
It's her preferred policy. I mean, she literally said yesterday her preferred policy would mean a hard border for goods, Fraser.
Yes, but James, Nicola Sturgeon cannot, to go to the Brexit debate, we cannot reveal our hand completely at this moment.
No, I know that, but this is the conversation we're having. I think you're wrong to say it wouldn't be Scotland's choice. If Scotland wants to align itself with single market membership, then it would be Scotland's choice, because the single market would be the one imposing or insisting upon the hard border. The British government would like nothing more than to have no checks at all on goods making their way into a single market territory.
Yes, of course. But we have not said we're joining the EU. That is a preferred choice. That's Nicola Sturgeon's preferred choice.
Yeah.
But what we're talking about is 5-6 years ahead.
Yeah, but Scotland voted to remain. So the only measure we've got of how Scottish people feel about EU membership is the 2016 referendum, which was a fairly sort of conclusive result, Fraser.
The result.
You sound like you're a little bit worried that actually some of the emerging detail of yesterday has, whether you've realised it or not, shaken your commitment to the independence cause a bit, because you're poo-pooing the idea that what seems to me to be inevitable will inevitably happen.
George, any border would not affect Scotland as much as it would England. Okay, say I could go through all the supermarkets. They have to send their stock north. We don't send our stock south, right? I'm a truck driver, James. I can take, say, salmon to Heathrow Airport. I can take, I also work with other fish exporters who take it right over the continent, okay? There is no ports and no airports that export from Scotland. That is a result.
I know, but this doesn't. This again. This sounds a little bit like dancing on a pinhead. This is
no. Where does whiskey leave from? Whiskey's made here. Yeah. Where does it leave from? It leaves from England. It's not sent on container ships from Scotland because we're not allowed to.
But it would still. So England might waive border requirements, and they'd only apply on goods coming into Scotland, which means the cost of everything in Scotland would become higher than everything in England, mate.
Not if we export from the continent. Not Holland and Denmark, who have tremendous fishing industry.
Exactly. So so British businesses would lose British custom.
British businesses might, but not Scottish business.
Okay.
We would gain.
No, all right.
We would start supermarkets. We have our own power companies. Remember,
but you don't. I mean, again, Fraser, you don't really expect the English government to sit there going, "Oh no, that's fine. We'll let the Scots just carry on while they punish us economically for not being members of the single market. We're not going to impose any checks or customs inspections on them." Fraser, you're being really naive, mate, aren't you?
Yes, of course I am. I'm expecting a fair world. I'm expecting people
You're not expecting a fair world. You're putting a hard border in Great Britain, and you're suggesting that Scottish businesses will be able to ignore it when they're selling or transporting into England. But the single market, as everyone who's paid the blindest bit of attention to the situation in Northern Ireland should now understand, and indeed, as Sefcovic has been stressing again this very morning, there's no earthly way that you're going to be able to pump goods into the single market without having checks at the border.
Yes, we can, because we'll export from Edinburgh. Edinburgh's a port.
Okay. Oh, okay. Right. All right. Okay, but not into England, obviously. I hear you. 18 minutes after 11 is the time. A great start, because I think Fraser demonstrates this has added a layer of complexity to the question of Scottish independence that was perhaps not immediately clear before. I'm also seeing reports that the Scottish government has announced the date. Angus Robertson, indeed, has, I think, the Constitution Secretary told the media that the next referendum will be in October of 2023. That's being reported by the national newspaper in Scotland. And one of my correspondents, Patricia, who just sent me that link from a couple of minutes ago, suggests that we may have just become the first British broadcasters to announce that date. So I flipping hope your sources are correct on that one. Otherwise, I'll be disowning it immediately after this. 21 minutes after 11. How does the spectre, if that's the right word to use, of a hard border in Britain affect your attitude to Scottish independence? Ian is in Renfrewshire. Ian, what would you like to say?
Morning, James.
Hello.
I think the difference between the prospective referendum this time round and the one we had 8 years ago is simply the direction of travel that Boris Johnson has taken us in. And I think a number of, I can't speak for everyone, but I think from speaking to friends and colleagues, that the prospect of a hard border will be actually a small price to pay in order to get us away from the direction of travel that Westminster has taken us in.
And that is despite the fact that independence now is a bigger what's the word I want? It's a big. Well, look, I apologise for the slight paucity of language on this one, but it's a bigger fuss than it would have been when you voted to stay in Great Britain back in 2014. This hard border was never on the horizon then, but you've changed your support for independence, even though independence now is going to be a bigger faff and fuss than it was when you voted against it.
I think so.
Yeah,
and I think that in a nutshell, if we had the choice of remaining in the UK under the current Tory government or remaining in the EU, I think a lot of people would say, take me into the EU, please. And I know that's a point in time thing. And if you had, potentially a Labour government, people's opinions might change on that, which I think is actually why Nicola Sturgeon is wanting to strike while iron is hot, as it were.
Mm. And I mean that. I'll use you as a sounding board, if I may. My caution to you would be, it's not that long ago Gordon Brown was Prime Minister, and the fact that he's Scottish is relevant to the point I'm about to make. Why would you cut this umbilical cord? And I'm not saying which one is the mother and which one is the baby before anybody gets cross with me about the status issue here. Why would you cut this connection because of one man doing so much damage in one office that is not permanent or eternal?
Well, Brexit is the single biggest thing that's happened in the last sort of 8 years, and I think that was the Rubicon for a lot of people. It was a step too far, considering that Scotland as a nation voted to remain in the EU. So I think that's been a deciding factor, and I think it will be interesting to compare and contrast the so-called prospective hard border between Scotland and England with the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic, and will we operate two separate or two distinct borders, if you like? Yeah, it will be an interesting one.
It will be, and I mean, you can't really see any way past it, but there it is, and you're the caller I asked for. Changed your mind about it, despite the fact. I need a better word. Can you think of a better word, Ian? I can't keep calling it a faff and a fuss. I need a slightly more intelligent sounding word for what independence including hard border is compared to independence not including hard border. What's the word I'm looking for?
Conundrum.
Well, there we go. No, I don't know that is. It's probably better than faff or fuss. Maybe I'll just go with faff and a fuss. It sounds like a Julia Donaldson book, doesn't it? A faff and a fuss. Thank you, Ian. Rebecca is also in Glasgow. Not that Ian was, but the fellow before Ian was in Glasgow. Fraser. Rebecca, what would you like to say?
Hi, I decided back in 2014 that I was doing a complete 360 on my politics. I turned everything on its head. I was a unionist, and I just watched as politics got uglier and uglier. We had Nigel Farage just, gaining strides, and other little parties were popping up. And it was a real fear for me that politics was becoming ugly. And even in the run-up to the referendum, there were so many promises made to people in Scotland that the only way to stay in the EU was to remain part of the UK, and so many nasty... what's the word I'm looking for? It was just a nasty, ugly fight. And
can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Why do you think Scotland has proven, and maybe it hasn't, and I'm about to embarrass myself yet again on the broad question of Scottish politics, but why has Scotland proven more resistant to the sort of bigoted rantings of Farage and his ilk? Why has there not been a McFarage?
I don't know. I don't know. Maybe we're a slightly different people.
Yeah.
I just find that there's a lot of tolerance. We have a different voting system as well. We don't have a first past the post voting system. We have a system where how you vote is better represented, and I think people are being better represented in Scotland. Their views seem to be more liberal. They are more caring in terms of politics. They're more caring. So I think people in England are maybe losing out because we've got a first past the post system.
Well, normally,
so it's not maybe necessarily down to people's natures.
No.
It's down to the fact that there's a political system where you make a vote, and it's really targeted at two parties in Westminster.
Sure.
So the other parties aren't necessarily getting the share of the vote or the view of the share of the vote in the House.
It's a great point. I mean, it's a question for the ages. Normally, first past the post can guard against lunatic fringes getting too much traction in a legislature, can't they? You don't have that proportional representation.
But it doesn't stop the ideas getting out there.
Or the main parties panicking that these toxic ideas may take hold among their own membership and their own voters, and therefore lurching to the right and introducing a referendum on Brexit in order to appease people who should frankly have been debated into oblivion with facts and evidence, but it's too late for that. So you've done it. I think you meant 180, not 360, didn't you?
I did, yes. I'm so sorry. I can't count.
That's all right. You could be Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport with mathematics.
There you go, a job for life.
What would be, final question, Rebecca, what would be, imagine the vote we think is October 2023, there's a vote for independence. Would there be any sense of regret the morning after that result came in?
No.
No? And that's a full turn?
No. I think politics has just remained so damn ugly. And it's not just down to Boris Johnson. Let's face it, we've had 12 years of Tories. 12 years of everybody being treated harshly unless you can afford to buffer that yourself. Now, a lot of people will complain that Nicola Sturgeon is, going into areas of politics that she shouldn't be looking at because these remain with Westminster. But she's buffered us from a lot. We don't pay the bedroom tax. There's other things, other little buffers that she's put in. She's raised money that's given to families with children and things like that she's buffered us from. And in England and other parts of the UK, there's not been that buffer.
Well, it's a simple distinction between left-wing and right-wing politics that you describe, isn't it? Rather than
it's a kinder politics up here. And I know not everybody agrees with it. And it's not a perfect system and it has got its flaws. But there's an awful lot of, unionists will, pick on the SNP record for things, but they won't say anything about the same or a similar record down south.
So Westminster gets a free pass, but First Minister Sturgeon gets a report card marked weekly. I hear you, Rebecca, and I stress again, people are more than welcome, in fact, actively encouraged to challenge anything that other callers say, especially on issues where I'm not fully confident of my own understanding, as with this one. Because as Rebecca speaks, this text comes in saying in England, the right-wing press attack the EU, immigrants, etc. In Scotland, the same papers attack the SNP and Nicola Sturgeon, so the hate is directed there. And yet at the same time, many people suggesting, here's one, I'm not sure I'll use you've used asterisks actually, so I'll say bottom. Brexit and Scottish independence are two cheeks of the same bottom. Regain control borders, sovereignty, etc. I have to disagree with that from where I sit. I don't see that debate in those terms. And oddly, well, actually, it's 11:31, so we'll take the very latest news headlines with Simon Conway, and then I'll tell you what was about to come after the word oddly. It's 11:33 and you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where the question of whether or not the admission, if that's the right word, by Nicola Sturgeon, First Minister of Scotland, that independence, which will next be referendumised, if that's a word, in October of 2023, whether or not the conceding that it would involve a hard border in Great Britain would change your mind in any way, one way or the other. So far, pretty clear support for independence. I can only work with the phone calls that I get. So if you feel that your opposition to it is being underrepresented, it's very easy for you to personally rectify that situation by picking up the phone. I wondered whether the added complexity, thank you, that's the word I want. I can't see who suggests it's a much better word than faff. Honestly, Keith, why couldn't you just come up with complexity? I can't keep all these plates spinning single-handedly every day, you know. I'm talking about the added faff or the added fuss. Complexity, the added complexity of a hard border may actually persuade some people back towards the union camp and away from the independence camp, because, independence in a single market is going to look a little bit different from independence not in a single market. I've upset one person so far. I didn't mean to. A tweet popped in front of me claiming that I'm getting lots and lots of things wrong, and that Ireland, this I think would be in reference to the conversation I had with Fraser, who conceded that he was being a bit naive or perhaps overly optimistic. But you're right to point out that trade from the Republic of Ireland directly to the European continent would once have come through the United Kingdom and now does not in large part. There's a sort of bypass. What was once a land corridor is now transited by sea. So that could be a model for Scottish exports, but not Scottish exports into Britain, which presumably remains its biggest customer. 11:35 is the time. Patricia is in Kirkcudbright. Did I say that correctly?
No, you didn't. It's Kirkcudbright.
I knew I wouldn't have done. Of course, it's Kirkcudbright. Kirkcudbright. Patricia is in Kirkcudbright. What would you like to say, Patricia?
Okay, well, that's obviously Scottish, as you know. As a very young person, I lived in Canada, where we had a border against this enormous, massive country called the United States. And it was banned. I've also spent 20 years living in France, and in the early days, Spain wasn't in the EU, so we had a border with Spain. And both.
Oh, I remember that. It's on the Pyrenees, wasn't it? You used to have to drive through the. Yes, I remember that as a kid.
Yes, that's right. And they had all these lovely little lanes and things. But it didn't stop us. It didn't stop Spain, and it didn't stop us. It doesn't stop Canada. That 3,000-mile border with the United States. What's the fuss?
So you said, well, I mean that one of the key projects of the European Union is to reduce the complexity of borders. I mean, this is why we have Schengen. It's why we have regulatory alignment. So that's the fuss. I mean, the fuss is it will be a heck of a lot easier to trade without border checks between Scotland and England than it would be with them. That's the fuss. That's the faff.
But it can be done easily, and we then have a free border between us and Southern Ireland, certainly here in Scotland. I live near Stranraer.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's just geography,
to...
isn't it? That's not even politics. That's just geography.
That's
a great point.
And we're 44 minutes away from Ireland.
Gosh.
And then the other side, there's Leith and Edinburgh, where they've got a ferry that goes across to Holland. We're not stuck on the English, the British.
That's a very good point. No, I mean, just because the gravity theory, isn't it, of trade, you trade with the nearest and the easiest people. But if you change that, the problem with Brexit, of course, is that all of the nearest and easiest trading partners have been cut loose, whereas Scotland, as you remind us, would still be very near Ireland and still very near continental Europe. So any suggestion that doing independence would be a bit like doing Brexit falls apart, doesn't it, on trading and commercial terms? It would almost be the opposite.
It just means we do have to get better roads across Scotland, that's all.
Can't argue with that. So
the A75 going well.
To paraphrase, you acknowledge the added complexity of a hard border, but see it as a price well worth paying for the benefits of independence.
And it's an easy way to... We've only got a 900-mile border, of which only 3 roads are big, which will take lorries.
So you're not going to build a fence or anything like that. It's only going to be the thoroughfares on which significant amount of product can be moved that are going to have to deal with...
There's 3 or 4.
What about smuggling? What about smuggling? What about whiskey galore coming back in a sort of different? What would you smuggle from Scotland into England? Avoiding
only whiskey.
Only whiskey. Thank you.
Maybe it might be the beef. And it could be the cheese. And
well, then you're going to have a
be all
problem,
sorts
because
of
then you're going to have single market requirements akin to what we have in the Irish Sea now to protect Scotland from Britain's reduced and diminished food safety laws and psychosanitary legislation. But that we'll jump off that bridge when we come to it. Patricia, thank you. It's beautiful language, isn't it? Really. 11:39 is the time. Alistair is in East Lothian. I think I pronounced that correctly. Alistair, what would you like to say?
Yeah, hi. Good morning, James. Good
Hello.
morning. First time caller, bit nervous.
Oh, don't be. It's only me.
It's Kirkcudbright. Kirkcudbright, mate. Kirkcudbright. Fascinating discussion, actually. I was thinking...
You sound surprised. Do you not tune into this programme on a regular basis? The discussions are always fascinating.
No, I do, yes.
Go on.
I was thinking that currently the checks on goods coming into the UK from the EU, the single market, are almost non-existent, because the UK doesn't have either the customs staff or the infrastructure to carry out those checks.
Yeah.
Why, if there was a border between Scotland and England and Scotland was in the single market, would there be checks? Because it would be more strain on the customs service, it would need more infrastructure built, and it would be...
Well, I think I can answer that question. I mean, it's not a definitive answer, but looking at who's in Downing Street now, what you're describing is a new status quo, which would be discriminating against English businesses exporting into Scotland while giving a free pass to Scottish businesses exporting into England. And I don't think a Conservative Prime Minister dedicated to populist and often xenophobic rhetoric would take much persuading. That the least you could do is ensure that those Scottish businesses have just as hard a time getting stuff into England as the English businesses are currently having getting stuff into Scotland.
Yeah, but what does England export?
Hot air?
Pretty much.
But you're being a bit factual here.
I could use a Brexit.
Of course you may.
Euphemism.
Yes.
They need us more than we need them in export terms.
The rest of the UK is Scotland's largest trading partner by far.
It is currently. However, that is historic.
It's a bit of a risk, though. You're rolling the dice a bit on this one by saying, well, listen, I mean, you know what happened when they said they need us more than we need them. It went the other way, mate. So it's not necessarily the zinger that you thought it was.
I was being glib.
Well, it'd be true this time. So you're looking at, this is some interesting statistics here. 60% of Scottish GDP is exports and imports, both close to 60% of Scottish GDP, and the majority of this trade is with the rest of the UK. So Scotland trades far more with the rest of the UK than it does with the EU, 4 times more, in fact. So even if Scotland were not part of the UK, a lot of trade between the two countries would continue because they're so close together, they share a common language and they're physically contiguous. But with a border, there'd be damage.
Right, okay. But the same was true of Ireland prior to Irish separation, Irish independence.
You're going back a long time now. You're going back to the 20s.
Yeah, it's only 100 years.
Yeah, I know.
You know, we keep being told that we can't separate a 300-year union,
yes.
and they forget that Ireland left 100 years ago. It is part of a colonial mindset that the largest and controlling part dominates trade and therefore sucks business to it. What has happened in Ireland is over the years is that grossly unequal trade towards the UK has diminished until now the majority of Irish trade is with the EU, and the same would happen.
You may be right. You know, the LSE research into this back in February of last year found that independence would hit the Scottish economy 2 to 3 times harder than Brexit.
Yeah, but what's the cost of staying? James. What's the cost of stay? And you look at everywhere you look at.
You mean politically and culturally and emotionally?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, that's the argument I can't win. I would never win that argument. I wouldn't even try, mate. Sit here saying, oh, don't be soft, it's not that bad. They're bloody awful. They're the worst imaginable government that any country I've ever lived in could have.
Everywhere you look is a bin fire.
That's beautifully put, yeah. And that's why the debate seems to me to be changing almost weekly. The worse things get in Westminster, the more they claim. What was the story today that you in a newspaper that yesterday was writing about how we've got to stop doing so much doom and gloom about the economy? Here you go, Daily Mail, Chief City reporter. Workers' pay slumped 4.5% in April, the biggest fall since records began in 2001. That's your average weekly earnings in Britain without bonuses. How much of that you attribute to the decision to impose economic sanctions upon ourselves is open to debate, but you'd have to be absolutely crackers to claim that it has absolutely nothing to do with it, and that is what Boris Johnson's Brexit government continues to do. So Alistair's sitting there in Scotland thinking, why the hell would I want to stay hitched to this bin fire, this catalogue of bin fires, when I have the opportunity to detach myself and my country? I can't argue with that. I'm not even sure I want to anymore. It's 11:45. 11:48 is the time, and Sturgeon plans to create hard border in Scotland has not so far proved to be the firework I thought it might be. And of course the rationale for not changing your view on independence in light of this added complexity to the proposal or to the project is largely how flipping awful government from Westminster has been for the last few years. I mean, notably since, of course, the middle of 2019. Especially since December of 2019, when they landed their 80-seat majority. It's astonishing to reflect, whatever your feelings are about Rwanda, if you are someone who enjoys these deliberately divisive racist policies or someone who abhors them. Well, we all know they're disgusting. Some people love it, some people hate it because it's disgusting. But it's a pretty sad day, isn't it, when you've got a government that's trying to shore up its racist base by implementing a racist policy but can't even get the racism right. It gets all the big calls right. He can't even implement a deliberately divisive racist policy designed to feed his racist base. He's managed to muff that up as well. Obviously, the silver lining is that you can now pretend that the European Convention on Human Rights is in some way linked to the European Union and therefore to Brexit. And the days of me thinking that's such an obvious and blatant lie that there's no earthly way, A, British government would try it, and B, the British people would swallow it, I'm afraid those days are long behind us, which all adds up, perhaps, to more reasons to support Scottish independence, even with the added complexity of a hard border. Mark is in Bowness. Mark, what would you like to say? Bowness.
Bowness, you got that right. Kilcoobie was a bit of a problem for you, wasn't it?
It was a bit, yeah. I'll just say Scotland next time, and that'll annoy everybody.
Just treat us as a region; it's far easier.
Of course.
I was gonna say that Alistair touched upon some of the things I wanted to say, but one of the things that people always talk about, the motive issue of a border, and at present, I believe we have a common travel area with the Republic of Ireland, which is reciprocated both ways.
Yeah.
So again, I can't see even the most right-wing despot in Westminster doing anything to change that.
That's for people, not for goods, though.
Yeah, and Alistair touched on quite a few things, and he was right in some ways. I mean, I was a reluctant yes in 2014.
Right.
And the reason for that was I said to your researcher that I could see the direction of travel where we were going. That somebody mentioned before that Farage was on the warpath.
Yeah.
And again, if you had proportional representation down there, you would have a different parliament.
We would.
Particularly So I'll go on to the good thing. The good thing is I work in food logistics. We send stuff down south every night and we get stuff back. And for Alistair, there are a couple of things that he's right upon and not quite so correct on. We would, again, Jacob Rees-Mogg was as I think April this year said quite clearly, there would be no control of goods coming into the country because that would be like shooting yourself in the foot.
Sure.
And that
was when he was too stupid to realise what he was doing, wasn't he? When he talked about how much it would have cost to actually implement the thing that Brexit was supposed to let him implement.
Taking back control, James. It's a good strapline, but in essence, the problems we would have in Scotland, we would still be able to freely transfer our goods into England and Wales because guess what? There's no controls. It's a smuggler's paradise, which is so often talked about on Twitter. And the problem we would then have is there are so much of our goods which are made to come back into the main supermarkets mainly.
Yeah.
They come back in and processed and back in to be sold in Scotland. That is Nicola Sturgeon's hurdle when it comes to feeding our public.
Right. That's quite a big hurdle.
It is a big hurdle because I think many years ago I was involved in a project for Her Majesty's government and basically in another life and another role. And we looked at upon roughly 10 days without bread on the shelves and you've got problems in the streets.
Of course.
Yep.
Yeah.
You've got to feed your public.
Well, I mean, this is supply chain disruption, isn't it? Which would happen as a consequence of a hard border. So you're not as relaxed about it as other callers have been. In fact, I mean, how would you vote now? How will you vote in October 2023 if it was brought forward until this afternoon?
The pragmatist in me says that October 2023 is pie in the sky. There's going to be a whole heap of legal challenges that are going to come along. That's not going to happen.
That's a good point.
You're looking at 2024. 2025, I would say 2026 is more realistic. From the food logistics side of things, moving stuff about, it's mainly in coming into Scotland. And the lady in Kirkcudbright alluded upon the fact that we have fantastic links through Northern Ireland, which is technically in the EU, down through into Ireland to Rosslare. My head already says that's a viable connection to get our jet stock, which is mainly seafood, and obviously you'll have heard about what's happened to the fishermen up here and what's going to happen to the farmers even more shortly once the Australian bit Bob kicks in.
But you're not worried then by this research undertaken at the LSE describing independence hitting the Scottish economy 2 to 3 times harder than Brexit because it's so inextricably linked, as you've kind of just alluded to.
But the thing is, James, I've not had the pleasure of reading that.
I've only just looked at it today. We find that the cost of independence of the Scottish economy are likely to be 2 to 3 times greater than the cost of Brexit. Moreover, rejoining the EU following independence would do little to mitigate these costs, and in the short term would probably lead to greater economic. I mean, look, it's 3 academics at the LSE. They're not infallible, but they generally know their stuff. They were right about Brexit.
Well, and thereupon you have to take the research or what they're saying today as serious. And that will be up to the policymakers and the people in government in Scotland who are trying to make this happen. And as I say, James, I can't see the 2023. Somebody said the other day there, and it was about maybe Nicola Sturgeon's grandstanding to keep our hardcore supporters online by saying, "Oh, we're going to have this; it's going to happen." And again,
I hear you. You're bringing the pragmatism to the sort of big tent pronouncements and announcements. What's the polling doing at the moment?
Again, I can only speak for people I speak to. I tend to stay away from newspapers and whatever's put, but I think it's roughly 50-50.
Yeah, I did as well. I did as well. So it's not sort of getting any turbocharges, and I wonder what would happen as the feet of Scotland get closer to the fire, or as Judgment Day looms ever closer. I don't know, but I promise you that I'll be covering it in a lot more detail and with a lot more knowledge and understanding than I did back in 2014. 11:55 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. PMQs on the way. I think we should probably. He's normally here by now. I'm a bit worried about him. Do you think we should summon the usherwood, please? I sometimes wish. Well, I was about to say, I wish we had cameras in the studio. They're blooming everywhere, aren't they? It's why we keep going viral. I wish you could see what I can see in the studio, because the corridor is a little bit like a science fiction film. And at some point in the next couple of minutes, Here he is. He literally, as I said that, came around the corner running at full speed because we've summoned him and PMQs is on the horizon. Now we're about to find out whether the door is still squeaking after yesterday. Did anyone... Oh, did you catch that? You caught that one? Yeah, so we didn't... Keith, you were supposed to get some WD-40, Keith, weren't you? Is that not your department? Squeaky doors? And, of course, Theo's a little bit out of breath as well.
Running, yes.
You all right? Do you want to take a moment?
Yes, please.
Okay, I'll just let Theo get his breath, but you can tell we're live. This is extremely professional radio broadcasting. That noise you can hear in the background is him unravelling his crumpled up notes. Could we turn his microphone down, please? Because he is genuinely panting, and I just want him to get his equilibrium restored. I can't offer you anything. I feel I should have. I've got a banana. Do you want a banana? There's a glass of. There we go. Oh, flipping out. We might need to, Keith, mate. We might need to tone down the old summons a bit. I think it's getting a sort of Pavlovan reaction now. Are you sure, though?
Yes.
I mean, okay.
Should we talk about what Keir Starmer's not going to talk about?
Go on, then.
He's not going to talk about Rwanda.
No.
Ever. Well, he might, but not in this PMQs. There's not going to be one question on it.
Because there's no political capital to be made. The people that already would support Keir Starmer are not going to change their minds about supporting him if he does go in on Rwanda, and the people whose votes he's trying to win are largely the people Boris Johnson is trying to woo by introducing a racist policy.
So if Keir Starmer were to mention Rwanda, his own backbenchers and MPs would want him to denounce the plan.
Yes.
And to say that if he were Prime Minister, he would not implement the plan.
Mm.
Boris Johnson will then say, well, you're not tough on
He's a lefty lawyer.
Immigration, you're a lefty lawyer.
From Islington, where he'd never lived, I don't think, but Boris Johnson did live with his lawyer wife.
Yes.
But hey-ho, details.
So,
okay.
So he's not going to mention that. I'd imagine he's going to go in on cost of living crisis. I think Europe's also going to come up, because I've got the order paper here, question 7.
Yes.
Anna McMorrin, shadow front bencher, and of course she was in the news today because she speculated that Keir Starmer could rejoin the single market if he were Prime Minister.
Right.
And I think Boris Johnson will use that either as ammunition against the Labour
do that?
Well, because she was talking about the cost of living crisis,
I see.
what we're facing.
Oh, so she was kind of echoing Tobias Ellwood in a
Yes.
way.
Would it be sensible to rejoin the single market given the pressures that everybody's facing, reduce costs on businesses, and of course that's been seized upon by Labour's opponents and by Keir Starmer's opponents to say, well, look, this is the secret plan, isn't it, for Labour to rejoin the single market.
Which is still politically toxic, they believe.
Yes.
So they must be getting that backed up from focus groups. And because, of course, I suppose unless you are
nobody likes to
enough
be told
to
they're
have
wrong.
discovered these oases of fact and evidence, which are as rare as hen's teeth in the British media, you're probably still buying the idea that all of the problems the country currently faces have absolutely nothing to do with the decision to impose economic sanctions on ourselves.
But as one Tory put it to me a couple of weeks ago, nobody likes to be told they're wrong.
No.
So if you turn around and say, well, actually, we've made a mistake, we
Well,
need
that's
to
why
rejoin
you
the
have
single
to
market.
keep blaming it on the people that flogged the project rather than the people that were persuaded to support it. But Starmer and the rest of the Labour Party are not even ready to address that possibility yet. So what will come up then?
I'd imagine we're probably going to hear more on the cost of living.
Right.
More potentially, I think, on the...
Very bad reviews last week for Keir Starmer, both inside and outside the party. I don't know how fair that was, but, I mean, he's not the kind of man who...
Yeah, I noticed that afterwards, and we were talking, we were perhaps more split on how that PMQs went compared to the rest of the journalists.
We're a tiny bit warmer than everybody else. But he should, I suppose the argument was that after that vote of no confidence...
It's very difficult for a Labour leader...
He should have gone in and landed some really devastating blows.
But I think the point we were making, James, was that it's very difficult to intrude on private grief.
Yes.
So if you're the Labour leader, how do you land blows and make it about you when really what you want to be doing is pointing out the defects in the current Prime Minister to his backbenchers? You don't want the focus to be on you.
What is the Home Secretary doing later today?
She's giving a statement at 12:30 on the Rwanda plan.
Oh, how long do you think we should listen to it?
It's 8 minutes long.
Probably we should.
It's
This is
eight
about
minutes.
the failed flight
to
Rwanda.
But I did a tweet earlier.
Did you? Gosh.
But the point I was making was you compare the Rwanda, there's so many parallels to be drawn with Brexit in 2019. And what you have with wedge issues, rather than, say, a more positive campaign, is that the other side by creating an opposition to a particular plan, often fuel the campaign that you are running. So, like with Brexit in 2019, you had the Supreme Court censuring the Prime Minister over the prorogation of Parliament. You had the Speaker, John Bercow, Boris Johnson insisting that he would get Brexit done by October the 31st. He didn't get Brexit done by October
Wash
the 31st.
your mouth out with soap and water.
But he made it, he only ever kept the impression with voters that he had done his very best to get Brexit done by October the 31st.